Like any other arcade game of its generation, Capcom's 1985 shooter Commando featured a sound system that was a whole computer in its own right, with RAM, ROM, and a CPU as powerful as the one running the whole rest of the game. But how did that sound system work, and how am I going to mod it? If you saw my previous video, you'll know I've just set out on a project to port the Commodore 64 chip music from this game to the original arcade board. In that video, we unpacked the sound system's hardware, and today we're turning our attention to its firmware, because for this project, I need to be able to answer two questions before I can start coding. One, how much of the hardware resources is my music player free to use? And two, how does the sound system get controlled? Here's why that matters. For this project, I'm being kinda ambitious. I don't just want to get Rob Hubbard's music to play on this hardware, I want to integrate it into gameplay. I want the game code to be able to control which music is played when, just as it does for the native music player. And I want the existing sound effects to play through uninterrupted. That means I need to know now which of the 12 sound chip voices are used for what, and I'll need to know the memory constraints that my code will have to live within for my music player to run alongside Capcom's original effects engine. So that will be the focus of today's video. I'm going to be prodding virtual probes into this thing to spy on it during gameplay. I'll be reverse engineering its sound firmware, and I'll be mapping out how its resources are used for sound and music. Last time, we looked at the schematics for the sound hardware and found that the game's main CPU and its sound CPU are connected by an 8-bit latch. Whatever one CPU is telling the other, it's telling it through this one chip. But what is the meaning of the bytes that get sent over it? If it's low-level information like individual notes and instrument setup, then my music player will have to live in the game code that runs on the main CPU. But if, as I suspect, they're high-level commands like keying on sound effects and music, then I'll have the easier job of just replacing the sound ROM. And candidly, if that sound ROM doesn't have all the music and effects on it, then I can't imagine why it's 16K big. So I want to spy on the signals going into the latch, and though I do have the real hardware to hand, it's going to be much easier to probe it virtually instead. So enter MAME. I'm sure you're familiar with this one already. MAME is an emulator of literally thousands of different arcade boards, and on the machine in front of me, I have it playing Commando. But MAME doesn't just play games. It also has an inbuilt debugger and scripting system, and best of all, it's open source software, meaning I can use it for documentation of the chips and the circuits on the board, and I can compile it myself and hack in whatever instrumentation I want, which right now is to visualize the main CPU writing to that latch. The source code you're looking at right now is MAME's top-level emulator for Commando hardware, and this function defines how memory addresses for the game's main CPU map to hardware devices like joysticks, graphics, and memory. A little further down, there's a similar function that does the same, but for the memory map of the sound CPU. You'll notice that they both have an entry called sound latch. For the sound CPU, it's defining which function gets called when that CPU tries reading from the latch. And for the main CPU, it's defining the handler for writing. In other words, when the game code wants to play sound, this is the function that gets called to handle it. Ordinarily, it's a one-line function that just stashes the byte away, but I'm adding an extra line in here to print the incoming value to the console. This is not particularly sophisticated debugging, but it should let us see the latch traffic in real time. So let's recompile and spin it up. My first thought was, this is a little more data than I would have expected. So I checked if the latch function was used elsewhere in the Commando emulator, and it isn't. These really are the writes from the main CPU to the sound latch, which are flowing at a very even rate, even when the game is silent. So let's coin it up and see what happens when it's not silent. Notice during this intro that there was almost nothing interesting happening in the bytes that we're printing out, even though we were already hearing both sound effects and music. The channel gets a little more interesting as the action builds up, but I think we've proven the point. The definitions for the music and sound effects aren't coming in over the channel, so they have to be stored in the sound ROM, and these bytes are just telling the sound system what to play, not how to play it. But how exactly are they doing that? The data that I've captured here I could describe as an endless stream of FFs punctuated by very short sequences of other bytes, and I have two ideas about what might be going on. One is that it's using variable length strings of bytes to make the sound commands, with an FF terminating each command like a kind of hexadecimal return key. The other is that each byte could be a whole command in itself, and the FF is just a placeholder for when there's nothing new happening. Or, who knows, maybe it's something else entirely. To find out, I want to try tinkering with this channel directly, and using the main debugger, I can do just that. It'll let me poke bytes directly into the sound latch, just as if the main CPU was doing that itself. But there's a problem with that, which is that the main CPU is doing that itself. Absolutely all the time. So if I write my own values in there, chances are they'll be overwritten by the game code before the sound CPU gets to see them. So how am I going to stop the game writing to the latch? One way would be to hack the code and just break it, which I don't think would be too hard, but I do think there's an easier way. That function that we saw earlier that defined the main CPU's memory map shows us that it sets the latch by writing to address C800. And this being source code, I can easily change it. So if I were to just relocate the latch's write listener to C801, then it doesn't matter that the game's writing to C800. It's not going to reach the sound latch there. The only thing that will write to the sound latch will be me using the main debugger, addressing it at C801. So let's recompile and let's boot up the emulator, this time in debug mode. Okay, G for go. And I'm not hearing anything. Okay, that's good. And I'm also not seeing anything. The instrumentation that prints out the sound commands to the terminal is still in there, and it's printed out nothing so far. So sure enough, it looks like the game is not reaching the sound latch, which means that we can. So I have a copy of the transcript from a previous game that we played. And what if I tried just plugging all this in to the sound latch? So byte at C801 is 00. I'm guessing that's some kind of reset. Does nothing. FF, we don't think does anything in itself. 03 is the next one. I'm going to press return. I think one of two things will happen. Either we'll hear a sound effect, in which case one byte is probably a whole sound command in itself, or I'll hear nothing, but we'll probably get it when I type in the FF. Place your bets. There it is. So now if I put in the FF, nothing. I put the 03 back in, we have the sound effects. Okay, cool. If I put another 03 in, then we get nothing, which makes sense because the latch already had an 03. So it's basically just one byte of RAM. And if you write a value to RAM that it already had, nothing in the system has changed at all. And there's no kind of flow control as we established, so it doesn't know anything's changed. So that would seem to be the reason that the FFs are even there in the first place. It's not actually a sound code in itself, and its purpose is really a foil. So when an actual sound command comes in, it's going to look different from the FF that was there last time. Well, let's test that theory. There were some small sequences of bytes that weren't on their own. So let's look at that one. 06, followed by 03, followed by 05. Yeah, these are all independent sound effects. Cool. I think we've got to the bottom of it. And if I look to the start of the game, what's 1A? That's the credit. And then 2-0. That's the intro music. Is it going to go into the game music? No. Okay. 2-1. So at this point, we figured out how the sound CPU is receiving commands. There's more research to do on exactly what the commands mean, but I want to turn my attention now to the sound system's next big unknown, which is the distribution of voices. Last time, we saw that the arcade sound hardware had two OPN sound chips. Each chip had two different flavored sound cores, and each core had 3 independent voices. This time, I want to know what they all do, and specifically, I need to know the split between the sound effects and the music, because whichever voices the sound effects generator uses, I'll need to set those aside, while everything else is fair game for my music player. And I've got a hunch. Given that there are 2 sound chips on this board, my bet would be that one is for music and the other is for sound effects. That would sound reasonable, given that music and effects should be completely independent from each other. During gameplay, there's 3 different background musics that could be playing, whereas the sound effects are going to be reacting to whatever's happening in-game. And I would imagine that keeping them separate in hardware would be extremely convenient for Capcom. And also for me, if my music player has a whole sound chip to itself, then that should make the integration process a whole lot easier. So here's my idea. If I want to isolate one of the sound chips so I can hear just what sound is coming out of that one, then I should be able to go to the memory map for the sound CPU and just comment one of them out of the memory map. In general, I wouldn't expect to get away with doing something like that, because if a CPU can't write to a chip, then next time it tries reading from a chip, it's probably going to get a different response than it would have got otherwise. Execution flow is going to deviate and all bets are off at that point. But in the case of the sound chips for Commando, we saw in the schematics that they are hardwired at the circuit level to only ever be written to, and there are no outputs from the sound chips that are upstream in any way of the sound CPU. So if I just comment out one of these sound chips, the code is going to work exactly the same as before. And indeed, in MAME, we can see that the memory map shows them as being write only. So I'm expecting this to work. So I've pulled one of them out. Let's recompile. And let's hear what it does. So far we have the sound effects. Okay. Let's put a credit in. This is sounding good. Let's start the game. Hopefully we will just get the in-game sound effects, no music. Let's find out. Well, that's music. At least it's some of the music. It's conspicuously missing the percussion. It kind of sounds hollow. And yeah, we're hearing some of the sound effects, but not the others. I've got the gunshots, we've got the, can I fire a grenade? Yeah. But if I kill the enemy soldiers, they don't make any sound. I'm not hearing the engine sound for the bike. Well, that's bad news. Okay, let's comment out the other sound chip and just verify. So now we're expecting the enemy death effect, we're expecting the percussion, the bike sound, some other things. Yep. Okay, well, I guess we found Commando's drum and bass chip. Yep, there's the splat. The engine sound is back. Yeah, it's just some set of sound effects. Okay, well, time for plan B. Okay, I've done a bit of digging, and this function is the one that accepts register changes to the OPN sound chips. The way the sound chips work is kind of weird in the grand scheme of things. We'll get into exactly how next time, but this function gets called whenever the sound CPU tries making a change to one of the registers that control one of the sound chips. And right away, it just does this little dispatch where if the register number is less than 16, it sends it to the SSG. If it's between 16 and 255, it'll send it straight to the FM core. So with this, if I were to just comment out, let's say the SSG, then we should hear the FM soundtrack in isolation. Let's give that a try. No sound effects. Ah, okay. That sounds like the complete soundtrack. Okay, I'm liking the sound of this. Yeah, absolutely no sound effects at all so far. Let's play through it. Okay, that's a whole level. Absolutely no sound effects at all yet. I think if there was anything... Okay, we have the death effects. I was going to say if there was anything else, we'd have heard it by now. If you can call that a sound effects, it's kind of the sad trombone, isn't it? Is that music? Is that a sound effects? Okay, that's a whole game, not a single sound effects. There's the player death effects, but other than that, no sound effects. The music, as far as I can tell, is sounding complete. Nothing is missing. We've gone through a whole game. We've gone through the high score. Yeah, I think that's it. I think the FM is just the music. I think the SSG is just the sound effects. Let's put that to the test then. Let's bring the SSG back in. Let's take the FM out. And sure enough, on this playthrough, we had all of the sound effects and none of the music. So, in conclusion, I was wrong. The allocation of effects and music isn't a division between the sound chips. Instead, it's a division within the sound chips. But it is still a nice, clean hardware division. I don't feel too bad about that. Capcom's effects generator can continue to use the SSG voices, and my music player will have free reign over the FM ones. But there is one remaining unknown when it comes to resources, and that's memory. If I want to hear the existing sound effects during gameplay, then my new music player has to fit into whatever gaps in ROM and RAM the effects generator doesn't use. So how am I going to figure that out? That's going to need a whole lot more instrumentation, so I'm going to do some exploring. I'll be back in a second. But first, let me share a fortuitous discovery. Quite by accident, I found that if you press the fire button while the game is unveiling its initial copyright screen, then instead of proceeding to gameplay, it takes you straight into a service menu. Pretty much every arcade game would have a menu like this. It's just unusual to reach it from player-facing controls. And in this case, it's lucky that I happened into it, because at the bottom of the screen, you'll notice a section marked Sound Code. If I move the joystick left and right, then I can stage a different number here, and whenever I press fire, it'll play a corresponding sound effect or tune. These sound codes correlate exactly to what I heard when I was manually poking the latch myself. And indeed, if we look at my instrumentation, then we can see it's just sending my selected number over to it as a single byte. I think this pretty much confirms that the API for the sound system is just 1 byte per command. And the fact that the sound codes in this menu only go up to 3F is instructive too. But also, this will be a much easier way of forcing commands through the sound latch than using the debugger, and that's certainly going to come in handy for what I need to do next. Which is to finalize the memory constraints. Here's what I found so far. This file is MAME's Z80 emulator, which is used both for Commando's main CPU and its sound CPU. And early on, you'll find the functions that get called when those CPUs try access memory. There's one for reading data, one for writing data, one for reading an instruction, and one for reading an instruction's arguments. For this project, I just need to know which addresses get accessed, not what for. So I've put essentially the same instrumentation into all 4 of them to mark the target addresses as touched. To get results out of this, I'm printing out the accumulated ranges of addresses that have been seen so far, using a function that gets called once every fixed number of accesses. With that in place, I can cycle through all of the sound codes exposed by the service menu, and hence see which bits of memory are really used and when. Just for fun, I also made a frame-by-frame version, so at the end, I can show you a visualization that'll let us see all this in action. Finally, I wanted some insight into how my code is going to integrate into Capcom's, and to that end, I've been doing a whole lot of disassembling and reverse engineering. I haven't covered the entire sound ROM, but I have now got a good handle on how its main control structures work and how it plays back sound effects. That was a great learning experience, and I think it's got some interesting stories to tell. So, with your blessing, I'm going to tell them. So, here is my visual guide to what Commando's sound CPU is really up to. As we saw earlier, Commando's service menu lets you issue sound codes up to 3F, which it turns out are organized into groups of 16. The first 2 groups are for sound effects, the third is for music, and the fourth is haunted. But let's look at the sound effects first, and I want you to regard each effect as having a color. I'll explain why in a second. Of the 32 sound codes in this section, 5 are stop commands, 4 are background loops, and the remaining 23 are spot effects, including 6 that are deliberately silent. The stop command, which has unnecessary duplicates, resets the sound effect system. The music will keep on playing, but sound effects will stop dead. Background loops are effects like vehicle engines that, once started, will keep playing forever, whereas spot effects are things like explosions that play once and end. Whatever the effect, it'll take over a whole chip, splitting its various components across all 3 SSG channels. That means you'll hear at most 2 sound effects at once. So, out of everything going on in the war zone, how does the game decide which 2? To understand that, we need to unpack the color scheme. For any sound effect, its color will tell you which of 8 virtual streams it'll play on, and knowing that will tell you which sound chip it'll go to and how its priority compares to other effects. For example, the effect for cannon shots has the color of this stream here, and if there are no other streams active for that chip, then you can hear it. But the loop for enemy vehicles plays on that chip's top priority stream, so if that loop is playing, it's that effect's sound data that goes to the chip, not anything else. But the very moment that the masking effect stops, you'll hear whatever was underneath it, even if that was midstream. During that time, if the player happened to be firing, you'd have heard their shots, because that sound effect has a color that belongs to the other chip. And in the bigger picture, that split is representative of how Commando's sound effects are distributed. One chip plays the soundscape of the player, the other plays the soundscape of the enemy. But since each chip can only play one sound effect at once, how would you decide the priority scheme? Take a step back for a second and imagine you're a UX designer. User interfaces come in many forms, but there's a couple of problems that almost all need to solve. One is how to acknowledge the user's actions so they know they've been heard.
Wait.
And another is how to alert them of events that need their attention.
Walk sign is on the cross. Jefferson.
And as it is with any other user interface, so it was with 1980s arcade games. For Commando's player-focused sound chip, what motivates the priority scheme is acknowledging user actions. The sound effects for putting in money, for example, goes on its top priority stream, because it's the sound that you're very literally most invested in, while acknowledging your grenades flying can go on the back burner. But the enemy-focused sound chip prioritizes alerting, where the question is, what effects are the most actionable? The sound of enemy gunshots, for example, merits a reaction, but the bullets are slow and predictable, so they get masked by the sound of approaching vehicles, which can fly in quickly and closely from off-screen. There are admittedly exceptions in the distribution, but the upshot of all this is that the game program on the main CPU just needs to issue sound codes. It doesn't need to know whether, where, or how they'd get played. It just needs to tell the sound CPU what's happening in-game. That said, there is one detail of the how that the game code does need to know about, and that's the color scheme. When a new code for a sound effect comes in, its data immediately replaces whatever was on that virtual stream. So if you were playing, let's say, this sound effect, and you wanted it to stop early, you'd need to request a new effect of a matching color. And that's the reason why there are so many differently colored silent effects. They're needed to stop the background loops, which might otherwise play forever. So that's it for the sound effects generator, but it's not the last we'll hear of it. The fact that the player death effect is implemented as music means that I'll need to somehow port it to the effects engine when I replace the native music player. So if you're curious how effects are defined in data, that'll be a future video. And talking of the native music player, its 16 sound codes are distributed like this, with 13 tunes, including 5 that loop, 2 stop commands that affect the music instead of the effects, and 1 haunted code. All of the tunes use all the FM voices of both sound chips, so only one tune can ever be heard at once, as you'd probably expect. There is some kind of queuing system that allows the intros to flow into a BGM tune, but in general, if you start one tune without using a stop code to end another, you'll hear weird clashes. On which subject, let's finally discuss those haunted sound codes. These issue commands that don't really exist. Consider it a bug of the service menu that they're even offered, or a bug of the sound ROM that they're not rejected. Either way, if you play one, then you won't hear anything, but the sound system might have been spooked, and the playback of future codes can suffer consequences. The problem here lies in how sound commands get ingested. When a new sound code is seen at the hardware latch, the program responds by looking up a handler for it in a dispatch table in ROM. Problem is, that table only has 47 entries, and if your sound code was past that, not including FF, then it'll interpret program code as a function pointer and execute some arbitrary part of memory. You might expect that to cause a crash, But the entire sound processing code is kicked off from interrupts, and there'll be another one of those happening very soon to bring things back on track. But in the meantime, the execution of arbitrary chunks of memory can damage various state variables and leave the sound system possessed. So that, in conclusion, is the whole dictionary of Commando's sound language. And we can now see how it all maps to hardware, thanks to the instrumentation that I've been putting into MAME. What I'm going to do is plug some sound codes into the latch, and then watch in real time how the various components respond. For the two sound chips, we can see the SSG and FM voices getting keyed on and off. And for the RAM and ROM, we can map all of the memory addresses within the chips and highlight the different locations as they get accessed. For example, watch what happens to RAM as I boot the game. That flash was it initializing its memory, but let's reset the display because that doesn't really count as those locations being used. There we go. Okay, let's feed some sound codes into the latch and see what the system does. If you know where to look in RAM, you can just about make out the variables for the 8 virtual streams that are playing the different effects. And meanwhile in ROM, it's becoming clear that there's a split between the program code at the top and the effects data below, which is looking conveniently sequential. For any effect, you can watch it streaming through the data, but also the effects themselves are laid out contiguously in sound code order. In a moment, I'll need to break a background loop, which is why you'll see a 1.7 go to the latch out of sequence. But between sound codes 1.4 and 1.5, pay attention to what's being pulled from ROM. That is genuinely a gap, and I really wanted to believe that it was data for an abandoned sound effect. But after lots of digging, it just seems like random bytes. Anywho, we've now swept through all of the sound effects, and any sections of the memory maps that are still showing black have not been referenced. They may not all be used for music, but the fact that they're not needed for sound effects means that my new music player will be able to take them over without fear of breaking something. Still, you might be curious about what the existing music player looks like, so I'll let it continue for a bit. As you watch the music streaming in from ROM, you'll notice it's laid out a little differently from the sound effects. With the sound effects, there was a single playhead that pulled in data for all 3 SSG channels, whereas for music, the 6 FM voices feed from 6 independent substreams. So, as a song plays out, you can watch the gaps within it shrink as it gets closer to completion. And that's about the only feature of the music player worth noting. We're going to be replacing it anyway, and thanks to what I've learned today, I'm now ready to make a start on that. We've figured out how the sound system is controlled and which resources my music player will be free to use. The rest is just programming. So, let's continue this journey next time, when I'll finally be writing some assembler and we'll be hearing our very first notes from homebrew sound code. Until then, thank you for watching, and please, do continue.